introduction to our platform. My name is Roberto Delgado, and we'll be introducing ourselves shortly, but I just want to echo Liz's opening words with thanks and welcome to everyone. Normally I find myself in the Washington, D.C. area, but this week I'm in the Shenandoah Valley on the ancestral lands of the Monacan people. Oops, we lost our slide. It's okay, next slide, please. We can go on. I'm gonna start off by providing an overview of the topics that we'll cover today. Hopefully we'll spend a little bit under 30 minutes or so before opening up the floor to questions and discussion. I'll turn it over to Olivia, who will also introduce herself and go over the scope and goals of the Aeon program, the Arctic Observing Network program. She'll introduce some of the Aeon projects, and I will take it over from there and switch over to some of our relevant funding opportunities and just a brief overview of the proposal submission process, and conclude with talking a little bit about opportunities for engagement beyond just the NSF Aeon funding program. Again, leaving the remainder of the time for questions and an open discussion. Next slide, please. So just to reintroduce myself for folks who don't know me very well, I've now been a program director, a permanent program director at the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs for a little bit over 3 years. I came back in August of 2018, so pre-COVID times, if anybody remembers those. I have been working on varying degrees of science policy and program management in the Arctic for a little bit over 8 years now. Initially, I came to Washington, D.C. as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow hosted by the Office of Polar Programs. At the time, I worked very closely with the Arctic Social Sciences program and a little bit with the Arctic Observing Network program, as well as a range of activities in the interagency space through the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, or IARPC, as I think many of you are familiar with now, as well as some working groups of the Arctic Council. The transition between my fellowship and my current full-time position was mediated through a government contractor position, which also soon thereafter got converted to a science administrator position, a federal official position at the National Institutes of Health, where I continue working on interagency Arctic science policy and program management issues. And in my previous life, I was a faculty researcher at the University of Southern California. My background training is in biological anthropology, very different from what I do now, where I focus a lot on evolutionary biology, behavioral ecology, community-based international field projects, mostly across the tropics, at the intersection of species conservation development, with some examples of biological monitoring and protected areas co-management in far-flung places like East Kalimantan in Borneo and the Zanzibar archipelago off the coast of Tanzania. I'll switch over to Olivia now. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Roberto. So, hi, I'm Olivia Lee. I'm a rotator for the Aeon program. I've been there since July of this year. I work with actually been working with Roberto for a lot longer since starting this position. I am also at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and my background is in research in marine and coastal ecosystems. I've been involved with some aspect of the NSF Aeon program since 2012, when I started as a postdoc with High Icon at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and providing some input to the Aeon program through the Aeon Design and Implementation Strategy Report. Next slide, please. So the Aeon program, I mean, some of you, I recognize some names, may be familiar with it, but we primarily encourage proposals that are focused on long-term field observations, looking at detecting Arctic system change. And the one difference with Aeon from the other Arctic section proposals is that we fund projects that are for longer duration than typical NSF grants, so 5 years. We focus on, you might hear some background, apologies, my son's home with me. We focus on being able to address what are the major drivers and impacts of the system change. And just as importantly, we need the data to be used by the wider scientific community. So there's very specific data requirements and lack of an embargo period compared to other Arctic proposals. As I mentioned earlier, projects can be for up to 5 years. Next slide, Liz. So we fund a breadth of disciplinary research, although I think we are best known for our projects that are in Greenland and over Arctic oceans. But we do fund both regular instrument type observing programs as well as community-based observing programs across ecosystems, human societies, land, oceans. Roberto will give a few examples of the breadth of projects that we have funded and are currently funding. We also support development technology type proposals of sensors or autonomous systems. Of course, if you're looking to propose any type of different type of project that you think Aeon has not funded in the past, please do feel free to get a hold of your program managers, Roberto or I. We're always happy to talk to potential PIs. And we're also very interested now, especially since we have had a few projects that have been long-term observing projects, at looking at opportunities to optimize our portfolio of what observing systems have been funded in the past, because we realize the importance of efficiencies in Aeon as well. Next slide, please, Liz. So again, a lot of text here, but we encourage for you to think about any Aeon proposals and its relevance to existing national and international efforts. From the national side, the US Arctic Observing Network, which can be confusing because NSF is also called the Arctic Observing Network Program. And from the international perspective, being relevant to the interests and work of the Sustained Arctic Observing Networks of SAON. And of course, during the biannual Arctic Observing Summits, opportunities to know what the communities say are of interest is another good way to be in touch with some of these broader Arctic observing efforts. And again, Aeon projects are designed to be of value to broad research communities, so there's no data embargo period. Next slide, Liz. So just a quick overview of where some of our Aeon-funded projects are located across the Arctic. And you can see that Arctic, it can be, not just above the Arctic Circle. We do fund a lot of projects in Alaska. This particular image is taken from the Arctic Observing Viewer, which is supported by the Aeon program through the Arctic Research Support Logistics program. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Olivia. I'm going to take over now, giving you a little bit overview of some of the current Aeon projects. But before I do so, I just want to thank Liz for putting in the chat several links, one to the US Arctic Observing Network, which is an interagency group, somewhat of a subgroup, a subset within the IARPIC collaborations platform, and also a link to the SAON, the international initiative. And just for added reference, both Olivia and I are involved in both of those initiatives in different capacities. And we can discuss that towards the end in terms of other opportunities for engagement with Arctic Observing Network projects. Yeah, this slide is just a brief snapshot. It's not comprehensive or exhaustive, but gives an indication of the breadth of disciplines across the Aeon portfolio, including several projects that focus on atmospheric sciences, freshwater sector, marine. A lot of oceanography is what sort of I inherited when I first came into the position, and some terrestrial projects that in some cases have been going on for multiple cycles of Aeon awards. And again, this is not exhaustive, doesn't include some of the eager or rapid awards that have been granted over the previous years, or career awards, which are other mechanisms which I'll get to in several slides from now. It's also important to note that Aeon does not exist in a vacuum. Olivia mentioned earlier that there are other Arctic section programs, including social sciences, natural sciences, system sciences, and we also have a polar cyber infrastructure program, which can be very relevant for Aeon, especially with all the data that are being generated across all the different projects. And there is also, for those of you who have taken a look at the Arctic Research Opportunity Solicitation, a smaller program called Arctic Research Coordination and Policy Support. And so given that observing and long-term monitoring that other agencies in the federal government operate in are important themes and priorities, both nationally and internationally, it's important that much of the data that are generated through Aeon projects are used for informing decision-making, resource management across a wide range of decision holders and decision makers. And I'll just conclude my remarks on this slide in that there are also other programs or other projects which Aeon co-funds, either with other Arctic section programs or other divisions across the NSF, the National Science Foundation. And we are really moving towards a more convergent approach, similar to navigating the new Arctic, which is another big idea of the National Science Foundation, in the sense that, for example, the Aeon program is tied closely to long-term ecological research initiative. Aeon program manages the Beaufort Lagoon ecosystems, LTR, on the North Slope of Alaska, and also co-funds with the Arctic Social Sciences program and the Arctic System Sciences program, the ILOCA project, which is sort of one of the exchange of local observations and knowledge about the Arctic. Really, really wide scope that we are helping to support. Next slide, please, Liz. I have a little bit of a lag, but there it is. Okay, so this slide is a good snapshot again of the relevant funding opportunities that are tied to Arctic observing. And I think this can be a little bit overwhelming, I'm sure, especially for folks who are not familiar with the NSF process. But what I want listeners to take away and viewers to take away is that there are different mechanisms, different instruments that can help support your proposed research activities depending on your particular interests, disciplines, and even career stages. First and foremost, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the Arctic research opportunities. And there is the publication number. You can search for these online or going to the NSF website or the Office of Political Programs website at NSF. And this is really sort of the catch-all for Arctic sciences. And here you can submit proposals that focus on basic science or a range of other activities, including conferences or large project support. Planning grants has been added to the new proposal and award policy and procedures guide for this year, that just this fiscal year that started October 1st. Some of you may be familiar with research coordination networks, or RCNs. There are also research networking activities, or RNAs, a wide range of opportunities. And while this may be a little bit overwhelming, confusing, that's the purpose of this. One of the goals of this webinar is for Olivia and I to introduce ourselves and be a liaison to help facilitate and to help navigate you through the different ways in which you can submit proposals for your research. At the end there, I added career, which is professional development. Eagers are for sort of exploratory types of research, sort of testing potential technology development, some rapid mechanisms that are available for time-sensitive issues or time-sensitive topics. We can again we don't have enough time today to go through every single element here, but just giving you a sense that there's a wide range of opportunities and instruments to help fund research. The next two are relatively new or have been enhanced in recent years, and are really targeting early career researchers, and also a subsequent goal or a subsidiary goal of that is to really also enhance diversity across the NSF-sponsored grantees. And so one is the Arctic Doctoral Dissertation and Research Improvement Grant. That's a mouthful, which has two deadlines per year and is really focused on supporting graduate students, principally at the PhD level. And it has been basically expanded. Before, only the Arctic Social Sciences program would receive and review and award doctoral dissertation improvement grants. But since last year, we've added Arctic System Sciences and Arctic Observing Network now participates in this program. One rationale for that was that a lot of times graduate student support was included in the budgets for the senior research proposals. And if those senior research proposals were not awarded, then that also penalized the students. So this way we sort of disengage that, that reliance on the senior proposal having to be awarded in order to support students. So we have a little bit more independence and flexibility in that regard. And then last year, we revived a postdoctoral research fellowship. So these are, again, early career folks who have since been awarded their PhD degrees, but have not yet found full-term tenure track positions. And I note that the next deadline for that fellowship facilitation is in February. And there is actually a program webinar coming up next week. And I think you can find the information about that on the OPP website at NSF. Any proposal submitted to the National Science Foundation and Office of Political Programs or Arctic Sciences needs to be in reference or in response to a specific solicitation. But there are also other opportunities where the NSF publishes Dear Colleague letters or DCLs that signal to the community particular priorities or particular areas that we'd like to emphasize. And so over the past several years, there have been several Dear Colleague letters, including one on community hubs for collaborations, really trying to enhance the relationship between Arctic researchers and Arctic residents. And of course, there are specific criteria and requirements that would go into a proposal that would ultimately be in response to the Arctic research opportunities, the very first mechanism listed here. Similarly, given pandemic conditions over the last year and a half plus, and the inability or the limitations of going to the field, we published another Dear Colleague letter on data and sample reuse. And I think this has been really, really valuable, especially given the limitations to field deployments over the past year and a half. This is tied closely also to not just the Observing Network program and the other science programs in our section, but also with our polar cyber infrastructure. Some of you may be aware that NSF also supports an Arctic data center, in which we require NSF-funded PIs to document data, or at least provide a record of metadata pointing to other areas. And if any of you have heard from the Arctic Data Center in their presentations, they often say there's a ton of Aeon data available, just sitting there, just ripe for the picking to test predictions and hypotheses, to develop models and to validate other observations and other predictions. And so, not every geoscientist, not every polar scientist necessarily has to go to the field to complete an excellent project. And so there's a lot of opportunities there with that Dear Colleague letter tying into our different programs. And then at the bottom of the slide, there are 3 other NSF-wide solicitations. One is called Coastlines and People, which has a forthcoming deadline in December. This is really geared towards a more socio-ecological approach. And Olivia may be able to say a little bit more about that. She's on the working group and can help describe that during our question and discussion session. There's the Long-Term Research in Environmental Biology program, or LTRAB, which also has open rolling, no deadlines really, so accept proposals at any time, that combines sort of long-term observations and even experimental approaches to understanding environmental change and impacts of said change. And one of our, what I think are one of our crown jewels at NSF in terms of the big ideas and with the focus on Arctic is the Navigating the Arctic, or NNA, big idea. The solicitation just went live for this fiscal year last week with a due date on February. And there will be several outreach webinars, including one that is scheduled for early December, which I believe will be on the IARPA Collaborations platform as well. So again, that's a lot of information to manage in this type of presentation. There is also a proposal and awards policies and procedures guide that is kind of the reference book for how this, your great idea actually gets converted into a submission. If I can have the next slide, Liz. I'll just briefly say a few things about the proposal submission process. We don't have time to go through all the questions and all the criteria and all the merit review aspects, but it's important that you and your institution, typically through a sponsored research office or equivalent, sometimes they're called, Department of Grants and Contracts or an Office of Grants and Contracts, are the ones who do the formal submission, even though you are the ideas person. And so there are specific guidelines in there that determines, the format, the required sections, including summaries and descriptions and budgets and justifications and whatnot. And that's all very important to know, but I can't, expect each and every one of you to read through this huge tome. And so again, a recurring theme throughout, I think, this presentation will be for you to reach out to Olivia and myself in terms of what you're thinking about, where are you in your career stage, what are your ideas, what do you want to achieve through research activities, and we can provide that initial guidance in terms of how best to continue moving forward. One other really important aspect, not just for Aeon, but for all the Arctic science programs, is that even prior to the submission process, there are opportunities to defray costs in terms of limiting or maximizing and making your budgets more efficient. And that is through finding external support for logistics, especially for deployments, especially going to Alaska or to Greenland, and those of you that work on research vessels, that can be planned ahead of time prior to submission with National Science Foundation. And through, we have a research support and logistic services contract, which is now handled by Battelle and the Arctic Research Operations Program. And they have a gateway, maybe Liz can put, or Olivia can put the website to that, which gives potential researchers sort of a menu of services and that logistic support that can be provided. You work with one of their project managers to develop, explain what your needs are for your deployments, for your field research, and they can provide a range of magnitude estimate, essentially, as a supplementary document that would go along during proposal submission during the process. And if your proposal is awarded, then you would work with the logistics provider on your field deployments, on the annual basis. So they provide this rough order of magnitude cost estimate. And that budget is separate from the science budget, which is great because it helps to alleviate sort of the burden on the science program. And they provide excellent services across the Arctic. Lastly, with proposal submissions, it's becoming, I think Olivia is learning even more so than me, that it's becoming even more challenging because the Arctic research community is relatively small and increasingly collaborative. And so conflicts of interest continue to arise. And we definitely welcome suggested reviewers, especially those who are not in conflict with you. And we are really looking to increase the pool of early career research, especially postdoctoral researchers or senior graduate students who have published, but may not yet have as wide recognition when we start doing our reviewer recruitment. So a lot of ways that the community, the research community, can help us as much as we are able to support the community itself as well. I think I have one last slide, Liz, before we stop and can finish hearing me drone on. Great. So not only do we do a lot as a funding agency to support a wide range of projects across the Arctic, given the role of observing in this time of rapid environmental change, we are also doing a lot of work through the interagency process, IARPIC, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, which, if you're not already familiar with, is a really excellent body, coordinating body that helps collaborate federal agencies conducting and supporting research in the Arctic, but also is a bridge to the broader academic community, to tribal, local, and indigenous organizations across the Arctic, and to other stakes and rights holders. And the interagency group is primarily tasked with implementing a 5-year annual research plan. Some of you may have been hearing about development of the next 5-year plan. There will be, have been, and will continue to be additional outreach activities around those in the coming weeks. But the way that the research plan is implemented is through a series of collaboration teams that focus on a wide range of themes: marine ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, permafrost, sea ice, et cetera. And there's one that is focused on Arctic observing. It's actually a sub-team of what is known as the Environmental Intelligence Collaboration Team, and together with a data and a modeling sub-team, really are at the forefront of collaborations and communication coordination around Arctic observing. And so I encourage you to explore if that's something of interest to you, that appeals to you, if you're at a stage in your career where you can devote a little bit of time to some of these broader conversations, national policy, research priorities, et cetera, and contribute in other meaningful ways beyond just the basic science that you produce. So I think that concludes our formal presentation. We have one final slide with our contact information. Liz, if you can move to that. The takeaway is, the takeaway that we wrote here is that when in doubt, reach out to your friendly neighborhood program officer. One thing that I didn't highlight enough is that we do welcome some concepts, these 1 to 2 pager synopses that we often, when people reach out to us, just so that we get a sense of what you're thinking about. What is your core questions? What is the intellectual merit, broader impacts of proposed work, and allows us to provide some initial feedback to identify whether Aeon is the best programmatic home for your proposal, or whether it's another section, another science program within the section, or perhaps even another division across the NSF. And we do talk with one another. Some of you may be familiar with other science programs like natural sciences or system sciences or even social sciences. We do hold regular discussions, conversations, such that we try to facilitate the best home for your proposals. So encourage you to reach out, don't be shy. We're here to provide those services for you. And feel like I'm speaking about Olivia, do you want to just emphasize anything else before we turn it over to discussion time?
No, that's it. Let's let the questions come in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Roberto, for an excellent presentation. I see a couple of questions that have come into the chat, so I'll start there. But before I read them off, a reminder to folks, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat. You can also use the raise hand function. And if you're on the phone, raise hand is *9. So the first question that I see is, what about Midscale Infrastructure also as a potential cross-cutting convergence program for joint Arctic funding opportunities?
Midscale. Okay, I'll start if Olivia has anything else to weigh on. But yeah, no, that is one. That is a cross-cutting across the foundation. It's not a solicitation or a program that I have been involved in, at least in the previous 3 years. There hasn't been a call for Aeon to be involved with that, as far as I know. But I'm aware that I think there are certainly opportunities for Arctic projects to be submitted to that, though that would be completely managed independently and funded independently of Arctic Sciences section.
And a question from Margaret asking if any projects have been funded in relation to the community hubs, dear colleague letter.
Do you want me to take that, Olivia, or?
Yeah, I think so.
Not yet. No, the community hubs, dear colleague letter came out last year amid the pandemic, and I think that has prevented teams and organizations to really come together and develop strong proposals. We can't get into details about that, but other than that, as of today, we have not yet awarded any. We're really looking forward to I think, getting the word out more about sort of those needs. There are activities within the interagency and also at NSF. I think folks are aware, well, I don't know if folks are aware, I'll remind folks that over the summer, we had an announcement, another position description for a rotator position that would be focused on the managing proposals and any awards that would come from the Dear Colleague Letter, some that was focused on Indigenous engagement, collaborations, knowledge, the co-production of knowledge. That position has not yet been filled, and so we are still looking to meet that need.
And there's a follow-up question from Margaret about whether any outreach has been done to Indigenous organizations to be made aware of that Dear Colleague Letter.
There was initially. Colleen Strawhacker is sort of the other program officer within our section, including myself, that were behind drafting and publishing that Dear Colleague Letter. We did some. It was more informal at the time. I think Margaret raised a really good point that it would benefit us and NSF and as well as communities to have more targeted outreach. Including, I think, in terms of proposal writing workshops. And that's something that we're developing through the Navigating the Arctic big idea, actually. But I think it would also be very relevant for that Dear Colleague Letter and other opportunities that may spring up down the road.
We've got a question from Michael Steele about what TRL level is expected for instrument development proposals to Aeon. I don't know, technology readiness level. Here, I will repeat that with the acronym spelled out. So what technology readiness level is expected for instrument development proposals to Aeon?
Olivia, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, so that's a good question because I don't think that there's like a one size fits all answer for all of it. I mean, especially if you submit it as something like an eager where it's more experimental, high risk. If it seems like there could also be high reward, potentially there's an opportunity for it to have some might consider a lower TRL, technology readiness level. It's really more focused on, we want to make sure that whatever we're investing in isn't going to just be a one-off investment. It has to be able to show that there will be some value or uptake by the research community, or if it ends up requiring future investment, if there really holds some good promise. We don't want to fund something just to see if we can do it. We want to see that there will be use for that technology developed by the broader research community. Roberto?
No, that's great, Olivia. I don't have much to add. I think, yeah, it really depends sort of at what stage that technology development might be at. Is there already some proof of concept that has been, or is it testing that proof of concept? It really varies. So we have some examples of eagers over the past few years that have been funded through Aeon, but in some cases, yeah, I think there could be full on sort of senior proposals, research proposals that would warrant that type of support.
Chuck Tesler has a question for the sensors and sensor networks. Is there a list of open problems?
Olivia, do you want me to start, or would you like to?
Yeah, you can start maybe.
Not to my knowledge, and that is part of the challenge. Even though there are a range of sort of initiatives and programs, not just our funding program at NSF, but other federal agencies, some international activities. And despite our sort of involvement, Olivia and my involvement at different scales and different capacities, there hasn't really, to my knowledge, been a good sort of inventory, although more recently in the past year, there is now a Polar Observing Assets Working Group that has been stood up through SAON, the International Observing Initiative, that is beginning to look at this question. I think really understanding what are the needs, that's what I'm assuming in terms of open problems, in terms of what types of instrumentation technologies are still required to generate the data that are needed for understanding environmental change and its impacts. And so I think we're at early stages of that. And that actually raises a good point. Olivia, do you want to say a little bit about sort of our thinking with respect to developing goals and strategies for sustaining long-term observations program?
Yeah, so I mean, we're at a point now where the Aeon network does need to have more of a strategic plan. So Roberto and I are both working on a process to solicit input from the research community, particularly those who have been involved with Aeon in some capacity, or those who are interested in seeing what the priorities for future Aeon development should be going into the future. We haven't yet decided on the exact mechanism of how we will be getting that feedback, but we wanted to bring that to your attention, and we hope to be able to share more information about how we intend to obtain that feedback. Anything else, Roberto?
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, and part of it, we've been waiting for, some of you may be aware, we have new leadership within the Office of Polar Programs, both at the director level. Since August, Roberto Marinelli has come on board as the new OPP director, and just in the last week and a bit, Jennifer Mercer was named the new permanent section head for Arctic Sciences. And so we didn't want to get too far ahead before we knew who would be our leaders and be supportive of the types of approaches we want to take. And this is, many of you probably who are very familiar with Aeon have longer histories than I do, probably think, this is a long time coming. Aeon was stood up about 12, 13 years ago following the International Polar Year, and also a National Academies report on towards integrating an Arctic Observing Network. There have been, a range of initiatives and activities. Olivia was involved through the search program, for example, and previously there were Aeon PI meetings and all things that sort of preceded my parents. And so this has been a lot of sort of long time in brainstorming phases, but never really an opportunity to act. And prior to my appointment, the Aeon program manager had been a rotating position. So every 2 to 3 years, there would be someone new, and perhaps a change in priorities or a change in approach of what was going to be the focus for Aeon over those 2 to 3 years while that rotator. I came in as a permanent, so hopefully that will mean consistency over a longer period of time. But at least my first few years, I was really involved in some of these interagency international activities, getting my feet wet, as it were, and now having Olivia on board, at least for the next several years, is a really fantastic opportunity to really move the program forward in a strategic, fashion. Some of you may also be aware that most NSF divisions, offices, programs have external advisory committees. Something called the Committee of Visitors also is a subset of those groups typically. And we're in the Arctic Sciences section had a Committee of Visitors last year during the pandemic, and there were some recommendations about, directed at Aeon in terms of ensuring that over the course of the coming 5-10 years that the program would be funding an appropriate balance of awards across disciplines. Like I think I mentioned earlier in the snapshot of awards, I inherited a very oceanographic rich portfolio, which is great. But have been trying to have better balance across other sectors, other spaces, including terrestrial and community-based observations and atmospheric and so on. Another recommendation that came about was to try to ensure that funding levels and that the funding levels appropriated to the program are at a good level associated with strategic planning to support a functional, long-term sustained program. That has been a bit challenging. Budget levels are beyond our control, depend on congressional appropriations. A lot of times we are on continuing resolutions. For the past few years, it's been relatively flat, and Olivia and I are finding real challenges. There are some excellent long-term time series data that have been really beneficial to the community. If we continue to support those at the current funding levels that we receive, it limits our ability to bringing new early career and creative approaches to the Aeon portfolio. And so we have to strike a balance somehow. And over this coming fiscal year, Olivia and I are committed to doing the outreach and soliciting input from the Arctic research community to help develop that goal and strategy.
I'm going to jump ahead a couple questions just because there's a follow-up from Margaret Rudolph about the strategic planning process. I will circle back to the other ones, don't worry.
Okay.
But Margaret asked, what about tribal consultation within the Aeon strategic planning?
I'll start and Olivia can weigh in and just say that, yeah, we haven't finalized all the approaches, all the specific activities. Tribal consultation certainly is one of the mechanisms that is, within our toolkit. And there will certainly be some component of that. I don't know if we will do a formal consultation, but definitely we do try to pride ourselves on the extent of community engagement that to solicit information from tribal organizations.
Sarah Webster notes there are other agencies such as the Office of Naval Research, ONR, that are also working in the Arctic and developing observing infrastructure. Does NSF collaborate with these agencies? Olivia,
do you want to give it a shot? Or?
I mean, yes, absolutely. All interagency collaborations is important and part of what we consider also with keeping our portfolio balanced. So both through the US National Aeon meetings and through the IARPIC platform, ways that we try to build those communications. We don't necessarily try to coordinate funding decisions, but we do want to keep track of who is doing what, just that we are aware that we're not duplicating efforts. Roberto?
Yeah, no, the answer is we do collaborate a lot with other federal agencies. Not always on the infrastructure. I think this question is specific to some of the observing infrastructure in terms of developing new infrastructure, but I think sharing platforms, obviously we work with Coast Guard a lot, and also Office of Naval Research, we do have several, I want to say co-funded projects, but there are interagency projects that are funded by multiple agencies. That makes sense. Sorry, a little confusing there. But there are things like the International Arctic Buoy Program or the Distributed Biological Observatory or Beaufort Gyre Observing System that are funded by multiple agencies. And we try to leverage, again, our equities, our investments, depending on our specific scope and goals of different offices and missions. The larger infrastructure question is a little bit beyond our small program, but we do try to collaborate to the extent possible.
And a question from Ajit Subramaniam, going back to the Dear Colleague letter about Community Hub related activities, is that supposed to be a separate bucket altogether? How are you thinking about proposals that include community relations already without referring to that Dear Colleague letter?
That's a great question. No, not necessarily a separate bucket altogether. Again, Dear Colleague letters usually point to existing solicitations. So folks applying, trying to respond to the Dear Colleague letter need to also be responsive to the scoping goals of the different programs that are in the Arctic Research Opportunity Solicitation. So it doesn't necessarily have to be independent. And we do think about those proposals in terms of, the Dear Colleague letter focuses more on capacity building, on communication, on engagement with Arctic residents, local indigenous communities. And that could be within the scope of an Aeon project or a social science project or a natural science project or a system sciences project, or it could be geared towards sort of professional development of the next generation of Aeon PIs, for example. So we are trying to provide more flexibility and support across the range of what NSF supports. Aeon is already a little bit odd. It's one of those few programs that doesn't require strict hypotheses or process-driven questions, really about setting up these observing platforms that generate data that are of wide value and benefit to the broader research communities. And so we are happy to talk and discuss the best way to frame a proposal that takes into account the requirements of the Dear Colleague letter, if that's what you want to pursue, or have it not be a distinct component of a conventional Aeon proposal. Olivia, I don't know if you want to weigh in on there as well.
That sounds good, Roberto.
Thanks.
Can I get the question from Gerald? Do you want to read that?
Yes, go for it.
Go, Olivia.
Yeah, Gerald asks about what are the current guidelines or restrictions regarding collaboration with Russian investigators and travel fieldwork in the Russian Arctic under NSF awards. I know that we already continue to fund projects where US PIs collaborate with Russian scientists or communities even. I don't think that we have any official guidelines or restrictions posted at the moment. Do you know of any, Roberto?
No,
Yeah, I know that internally we are discussing about ways that we can improve opportunities for collaboration. I think as US PIs, we don't restrict your travel or fieldwork. There may be more restrictions for us as feds than for you as the PIs. So based on that, what you might feel are challenging opportunities for travel for some section of the government to reflect on the research that you want to do.
And another question in the chat from Lisa Sheffield Guy. For community-based research projects, is there flexibility within the public data policy to allow for Indigenous data sovereignty, perhaps just reporting metadata rather than full observations?
Short answer is yes. So every proposal, NSF proposal submitted needs to include a data management plan. And within the Arctic Sciences section, there are additional guidelines, and for Aeon, even more so, sort of more strict in terms of the timeliness in getting those data out or metadata records available. But they add that's, there are sensitive, Indigenous data issues as well. And so there are a lot of times we can make accommodations, arrangements to ensure, privacy and minimize any unwanted data observations getting out that communities and tribes are not willing to share, but still, at least in principle, meet the data policy requirement. And so usually, the nature and the scope of how that works is discussed with the program officer, the managing program officer, once there's an intent to make a recommendation for award, and then data management policy is reviewed and modified to ensure that it meets the needs of the NSF guidelines, as well as the Indigenous communities from which the data are being generated or gathered.
I'll add too that we do co-fund projects with Arctic Social Science. So if you feel like your project might fall somewhere in between what Aeon would typically cover, or might be more also looking at what social science program might fund, feel free to copy both program managers at the Hill and Roberto and I on a preliminary project scoping discussion.
We have time, I think, for one or two more questions. I'm not seeing any more in the chat, but if anyone has a final question or two, you can real quick put it in the chat or raise your hand. And again,
can I ask a question, Liz?
Go
just,
for it.
Real quick in the chat, if anyone can share if they feel like they like opportunities to give feedback to a strategic plan via email or a survey or a white paper, what your preference might be, or if you have any other suggestions, just any kind of feedback right now, Roberto and I have your attention, would be much appreciated.
I think everybody wants to submit to a federal register notice, right? That's the best way. Or not. People can propose workshops, potentially a series of workshops, or we can set up an email alias. We can do surveys. We can have PIs meeting, community meetings for Arctic Observing. Hopefully, we can do something at the Arctic Observing Summit in the spring. Thoughts, ideas? We're open to anything and everything.
Well, I'll put one more last call out for questions or input.
Well, people are thinking about those approaches, or they can email us directly. That's fine too, if they're a little bit shy with sharing their ideas. Olivia and I would like to also just acknowledge and recognize Shoko Shimura, Dr. Shoko Shimura, who is new AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellow hosted by Office of Polar Programs. Although she's not officially assigned to the Aeon program, I am serving as her mentor, and she really is interested in helping us with developing this strategic plan for Aeon. And so I just saw her come on video. Shoko, do you want to just say a few words of introduction to this group?
Sure. Yeah. My name is Shoko Shimura. I'm in NSF's OP Office of Polar Programs. I'm technically an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. So I'm new to this space as of a couple months ago, but I'm really happy to be here and to contribute in all the ways. So yeah.
Thank you, Shoko.
And to all currently funded Aeon PIs, if you have not just groundbreaking science, but really interesting broader impacts that are resulting from your project, please share them with us. We really like to be able to share the outcomes from our PIs that are funded or your students as well. We can leverage the Polar Programs newsletter and hopefully get you a lot of recognition for the good work you're doing.
Absolutely. That's a great reminder, Olivia. Yeah, especially new publications are coming out from your excellent work. If your institution happens to also issue a press release, we can help amplify through NSF communications channels. Our leadership, our senior leadership, our section heads, office directors, assistant directors, they have regular meetings and often ask for science highlights and ask from officers like Olivia and myself to present on all the cool science that we're supporting. If you have something really neat, some new findings, some new publication, yeah, definitely send them our way, and we'll try to amplify to the extent possible. Sometimes they get sent to the White House also, just for recognition, especially under the current administration priorities on climate change. And so a lot of opportunities for.
Any other final wrap-up words, Roberto or Olivia?
I appreciate everyone's attention. Yeah, and Shoko put in, thinking about different ways to provide feedback. We'll be meeting with our section head in the coming weeks and proposing a plan. And yeah, if we get some input from you, that would be really helpful as well. So thank you everyone for your attention today.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Roberto and Olivia, for great presentation, lots of really good information. The recording for this event will be posted on the event page and on our YouTube. So if you missed something and want to go back, or if you have a colleague who wants to have, who missed but wants to tune in, that'll be available by the end of the week. And we hope to see you at future IRPIC events. So thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody.